So welcome once again to all the panelists, and we have a very distinguished panel here with us. All of them are global leaders for their respective organizations, and I'm sure that we'll learn a lot from them in terms of how their organizations are handling this particular situation. Something else that I would want to highlight is that this session is actually being telecast live as well, so we have a lot more viewers which are watching it on their phones as such. So I define VUCA as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But I would like to just start out by defining VUCA in the travel trade perspective also. Volatile. Any news on increased COVID cases, the sentiment goes down, travel takes a hit. Uncertain. We can't plan for the future. Everyone wants to wait till the last minute to plan their travel. Complex. Each country, maybe each state, they have different norms and regulations for entry, exit, and while you're there. Failing even one parameter amongst all these, your trip is jeopardized. And ambiguous, while we try and keep up to it, we'll never know the exact guidelines always, or probably don't have the right answers. People at the airports are not aware of the regulations, which leads to confusions. So this is a typical scenario which is prevailing right now, and I'm sure all the travel trade tourism stakeholders agree to this, that the current scenario defines VUCA for the travel trade for sure. So to start out with, I think I'd like to start with Phil here, that Qatar possibly hosted one of the largest events that one could think of, which is the FIFA World Cup, which was held late last year. And in the situation that we were planning for this event, how did the country, how did Qatar Tourism plan for such kind of VUCA situations? Did you have a plan A, B, C in place, and how did you go about it? We'd all like to know and learn from this experience of yours, please.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, so the World Cup, I'm not going to, from a tourism perspective, I'm not going to take all the credit. There was a whole big department set up, which was called the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy. But obviously, the bid was won back in 2010, so they had 12 full years to be ready. And there was a huge amount of work that went into preparing, obviously, the country infrastructurally and stadiums and spectators' experience and spectator safety, of course. So, but then you need the buy-in from all the different departments as well. So I think where we came in, not just us as Qatar Tourism, but also, of course, the airline, of course, the Ministry of Public Health and our fabulous health system that we have there, the Ministry of Immigration. So then we had obviously large working groups to make sure that any sort of possible eventuality was covered. They sort of thought of everything, really. I mean, one of I think the big things, and it's not the first time it's been done at World Cups, and it's done at other major tournaments as well, but you have basically a fan ID, so that we called ours the Haya card, and spectators who are coming for the tournament are able to pre-populate their details into the application. So it effectively acts as a passport, if you like, but entry into the country, but also the organisers can track their movement. So if there is any issues or anybody gets sick, or so there's a situation that can be contained quite quickly. Huge amount of crisis management if there is any that's needed to be taken care of. There was operations centre, as I said, that with all of the different entities involved and who was going to action it. There was a huge amount of communication that was going on throughout the whole country. I mean, and in a way, you could argue we were lucky in that everything was being done in one city. The first time that's ever happened with a World Cup. It's normally spread over multiple cities across vast distances. So we had that as a plus in terms of being able to coordinate the whole operation and coordinate any possible scenarios that might crop up. But then, of course, that added its own complexities, because then you've got to ensure that the safe movement and the enjoyment factor is there for a large amount of people over in a concentrated space. So you know, all in all, I think, you know, it was a collective. You know, it's the sum of the parts, isn't it? You know, if one department's not pulling their weight, then the whole thing, so that the stack of cards is going to fall over. But I think, you know, everybody came together. We all knew how important it was. We all knew the eyes were going to be on Qatar. We had a huge amount of time to organise it. You know, and I know a lot of numbers have been bandied around, and it is a huge number. I mean, 220 billion is the number that's being bandied around. It's, you know, most expensive World Cup ever. But I think those, just to put the record straight on that one, I mean, it's all part of the 2030 vision for Qatar. It's not, they didn't build those hotels just for the World Cup, or build those malls just for the World Cup, or the metros, or the attractions, or the water parks. That's part of the vision to create not just a fabulous place for people to work and live, whether it's locals or expats, but also to drive our tourism numbers and our contribution to GDP. So just put the record straight on that one. But yeah, I mean, as I say, it's a coordinated effort. You've got to plan for every eventuality, and I think they did that. I mean, I think they came across very well. You know, safest World Cup ever, most family-friendly World Cup ever. Absolutely no trouble, no hooliganism, no drunkenness, no, you know. So I think in terms of fan experience and the delivery of an exceptional sporting event, I think we, without blowing our own trumpet, I think we did a pretty good job.
No, definitely. I mean, it was one of the most successful events that anybody has seen. But what we also saw probably was a clear strategy that entry into Qatar was not that easy pre-World Cup. So you were really controlling the spread pre-World Cup. And as soon as the World Cup approached, I think from November onwards is when people were free to come in. So that was also calibrated in a manner and controlled. So there's a clear strategy which was being used, and
no,
it's very well appreciated.
It's a good point. Yes, which I didn't mention. I mean, frustrating for us as tourism, because obviously the country was closed for most countries pretty much up until the end of February, and even after that we were very strict on people having to download all their certificates and do their PCR tests. So we were definitely more restricted than other countries. But as you said, that was part of the grand plan, because the last thing we wanted in the build-up to an event of that scale is to have any sort of an outbreak happening in the country. So that,
correct.
yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Phil. Coming to Mr. Sridhar, so Singapore post-COVID opened in a very calibrated, measured manner, but I think it saw a huge surge of tourists from India once things were open, and there was a very good traction from the Indian market. Things were going all well and good, fine, and suddenly there's an announcement by the Indian government that all the travelers to Singapore require an RT-PCR test while they need to come back. And that suddenly dipped the overall sentiments, and people didn't want to do that RT-PCR, and the euphoria died down a sudden death.
I wouldn't use such dramatic words, but yeah, go ahead, Vinay, sorry.
So how do you, from a tourism board perspective, how do you look at it? How do you handle such situations?
First of all, namaste, namaskar, vanakkam, and vandanam. I would like to, so Singapore Reimagine is our campaign tagline. So I would like to first start off by reimagining VUCA, right? We are in the travel space. We are in a very privileged fraternity of being pragmatic optimists. If not, we shouldn't be in the travel and tourism space, right? So I was thinking, what is VUCA? VUCA in the travel space to me is, V is for venture. We will always venture. Whether it's a business travel, MICE travel, leisure, cruise, we will always venture. So there's always people going to be venturing out. U is for uncover. Customers are always continuously uncovering, discovering, exploring cultures, experiences that will continue. C, okay, I'm going to cheat on this C. C is for three things: care, connect, and celebrate life. I think COVID taught us all to take a lot of care for ourselves, for our family, loved ones, for community. And I think that is going to continue, and care for environment. So even as we travel, that's going to happen. We are going to connect, we are going to celebrate life, and that's going to be part and parcel of travel and hospitality. And A is for adaptive travel. We are going to, the important point is this: travel is now not it is used to be in the non-essential spend category. It still is. But for me, it is now an essential, non-essential spend. We all plan for travel. We all put aside budgets. And what happens? We will adapt and travel to where the welcome is warm, widespread, and inviting. So that will happen. That's my definition of VUCA.
That's a fantastic one, and I think I need to take these notes and write it down. And
Yeah, you can copyright it as
yes,
either.
you can copyright it, and I think Fairfest can also publish it, giving a very
Yeah, with
positive
due
outlook to VUCA. Very nice, sir.
No, I mean, jokes aside, that also captures the essence with which what we are doing in Singapore. So it was a calibrated, deliberate opening, just like Qatar. And I also see different countries doing different ways of opening up. We were very, very calibrated. Singapore was probably one of the latest to really open up. So 1st April 2022 is when we did vaccinated travel framework and we opened up the country, welcoming travelers, welcoming vaccinated travelers. And as you rightly said, Vinay, India was our 3rd largest source market pre-COVID, after China and Indonesia. With China not in the picture, India was the 2nd largest source market. We finished the year 2022 with 6.86 lakh visitors,
Wow.
which is about close to 50% of the 2019 pre-COVID. So thinking that it's from April to December when the bulk of the travelers came, there's a good number. And then you're right, I was happily looking forward to the year end and the new year, and then suddenly the Indian government announced RT-PCR is required from 1st January for 5 countries, including Thailand and Singapore plus China. What did we do? I think we adapt. So as I said, the great thing about India is Singapore is one of the must-visit destinations. What we have done is we have worked with a lot of our partners, putting out communication that Singapore is very much open. So on the Singapore side, we are open, right? RT-PCR, very easy to get in Singapore. Get your COVID insurance, come, travel, be comfortable that Singapore is a safe, friendly, warm and welcoming destination. And so far, I think, yes, there's been a slight dip, but we are very, quite positive that in the coming weeks and months, the travel will pick up and we will welcome a lot of visitors from India to Singapore.
Super. So, adding to the question that, just following up to the question to Mr. Sridhar Naresh, because Resort World Cruises, obviously Singapore is one of the major ports of call. So the RT-PCR test definitely impacted the Resort World Cruises also. Now, the cruising business is a very highly capital intensive business. You need to prepare for resources much in advance, invest. Human resources, you need to get them on board. How do you, again, handle such kind of situations where suddenly, you've done all your bit, you've lined up everything, and then traffic goes away?
Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me here. So yeah, as you rightly said, we are indeed living in unique times, or the VUCA times, by your definition of VUCA, and we leave Sridhar to be, his definition to be published with Fairfest. Okay, so indeed, actually, these are crazy times. But the point is, how fast can you adapt yourself? Things are changing, things are very fluid for now. So if you ask me, there's a two-way process that we defined basis of how the situations came in. When Singapore opened up in a calibrated way, we have to work with authorities like Singapore Tourism Board and adapt to all the norms that are dictated onto us to ensure that there is no spread of the virus on board the ship. So while those are taken care of, you also have to adapt for a case of eventuality. What if it happens? So to add on, the clinic on board, we started manning it with 2 doctors, 6 nurses, 24/7. There were cabins left empty and to be used as isolation cabins. What if it happens? Touch wood, I would say the entire operation, no case on board. And that's purely because of the restrictions that, and the norms to be adapted and the guidance that Singapore Tourism Board and the authorities gave. Adherence to that led to a safe operation. So that was one part of it. So while all this was going up and Singapore started opening up more, the masks started going off, then came this announcement in December. So when the announcement came in, was it a dampener? I would say yes, to a certain extent. But was it a dampener to the FIT business? No. The FIT business continued. What stopped temporarily, and I hope it's temporarily, was the MICE business. And why it stopped was because here a corporate is essentially paying for an RT-PCR for so many of his dealers that he's taking on board. But, and I'm sure Sridhar will agree, when this announcement came in 2 days' time we came with a solution where the RT-PCR could be done on board the ship, where the clinic would come on board. So the point I'm trying to put across is how cruise lines adapt themselves.
And agility.
Exactly. So because the requirement was the RT-PCR has to be done 72 hours prior to you take a flight. So we coordinated all of that, whether an RT-PCR could be done in Singapore or in Malaysia, but managing the 72-hour timeline depending on the itineraries that we do. So that got adapted. Now, in order to still attract the MICE business, MICE is a very critical player in our business. It's a huge contributor, and that creates the base for a cruise line ship. Then we started was a dual home port for the Genting Dream, the ship out of Singapore. What she does is you can either board the ship in Singapore or you do a similar itinerary XKL where Singapore becomes a port of call. And that we started promoting now. Why? I'll come to, why we did that was earlier the Malaysian government had this requirement. Obviously, for you to do an itinerary XKL, you need is a double or a multiple. Minimum that you need is a double or a multiple entry Malaysia visa. And Malaysian government was only issuing a single entry e-visa. That doesn't suffice to complete the itinerary. But about 10 days back, the Malaysian government made the announcement where you could get a multiple e-entry e-visa for certain categories, and they included cruise tourism to be a part of that. There was an opportunity for reviving the MICE business. So with this dual home port, now we started promoting for the MICE groups, if they can board the ship from KL, come into Singapore, explore Singapore as a port of call, get back into KL, because Malaysia is not listed as a country where RT-PCR is required. So that's how each one of us stakeholders in development of tourism or development of a certain industry started thinking in different, which possibly pre-COVID, I think all of us were very happy in our own world. It was happening, business was usual. But I think with COVID coming in, we were somewhere forced to think out of the box, make it convenient for the guest, and at the same time ensure safety is not compromised by any means.
Very well said, in fact, Mr. Naresh. So there have been a lot of books and articles written about leadership in VUCA times and things like that, and management during VUCA times, and all of them come to this, that the traditional ways of management and leadership failed during VUCA, and you need to very quickly adapt, you need to be agile, you need to have a vision and respond to these kind of situations really fast, and organizations which are able to do that are the ones who will survive and go forward. And we also learn from our customers. So just to give you an example, when this RT-PCR was introduced and we had some customers going to Singapore on board the cruise, and we were figuring out what to do, we were all worried. They came back to us and said, don't worry, we'll drive to Malaysia, we'll come back and we'll take a flight from there. So you just need an RT-PCR from Singapore, not from Malaysia, so we'll manage. So obviously, I mean, this kind of leads to people also trying to find out ways and thinking out of the box. So absolutely there, right to the point. Since we have the pleasure of Mr. Sanjeevji also here on stage with us, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask him a question that I remember post-COVID, TTF Kolkata was the first show that you started out with, and I was there at the opening. And post that, you did an OTM in NESCO, which was the first travel trade large format show which happened post-COVID. And see, while this show is for the travel trade, but you are essentially yourself also a MICE player, right? Because you're organizing such large conventions and exhibitions. So I would want to take your views. What made you take that stand to be the first one to take this initiative and have the first large format travel trade right after COVID, when everybody was still scared, postponing their events, etc.? What did you do which was different from others? What thought process were you working on that time?
Well, That's a very interesting question for me. And so, yeah. So I hope you would not mind my for venturing into, a little background. When, in fact, I was interacting with Sridhar also, certain opinion about, what this entire pandemic was about. So, when this came in like a tsunami, and we were all threatened. And so, I thought that, look, it's better to be an activist rather than to be dead. Because, this tsunami was so great or so big that, look, it sort of, especially in a poor country like India, we could clearly see that, look, more people could die of, poverty and hunger than of COVID. And so that led me to sort of, wear the hat of an activist. And I sort of, started dabbling into the science and the politics of it. And I realized that, look, the world was divided into two halves. One which would say that, look, this is like any other disease. It's like a, very wide but not so deadly pandemic. And Sweden was the leading light. Sweden never clamped lockdowns. And so there was a sizable body of, doctors and activists who believed that, look, this is more of a information problem rather than the real problem. And, we saw, the two sides warring, and I put my lot behind the, anti-lockdown. It was called anti-lockdown sort of lobby. And I worked with, very closely with a very great professor of medicine in Stanford. His name is Jay Bhattacharya. He's infamous, for, very early on articulating that, look, lockdown should not be there at all. It should be focused protection. Only the vulnerable, which is old, should be protected, and economy should not be closed. And I even penned articles with him, co-authored article, and which nobody would publish, because most of the media believe that no, this is like, you are risking, you're creating a risk for the for some people. And then we were lucky to find some publisher like the Print, which is a very strong online publication, and we did articulate this view. And even I wrote to the Home Ministry here that, look, you cannot curtail our freedom to travel within the country, which is constitutionally guaranteed. So you cannot you cannot say that, look, I cannot come out of my house, go to another state. That is my birthright, or that is like my, fundamental right. There is no war, you can't have an emergency for so long, like 1 year, 2 years, And then, we were very happy that they inserted in their lockdown circulars. And we had a number of circulars, 1, 2, lockdown 1, 2, 3, if you remember. But they would always insert that, look, interstate travel is not banned. And then I even wrote to Supreme Court, that, look, this is a fundamental rights issue, and, you probably want to intervene. And they did intervene when a lot of people were actually trapped in Delhi. You might have seen in, in the news media, a lot of poor migrant workers were trapped in the cities, and they were not allowed to go home. I said that, look, what could be a bigger human rights abuse? You're not letting people go home. And at the same time, we were running flights to bring back Indians and, Vande Bharat and all that, Then, so, all this, I believe, it's not that I'm an activist, but then, that was a natural response. And I venture to suggest that, look, probably we need a little bit of that in the industry, because industry associations were silent, and they were none were sort of coming forward that, look, this kind of lockdown strategy, prolonged lockdown strategy is counterproductive. And now after CCP revival, kind of a U-turn, from zero COVID to complete opening, we would like somebody arguing for lockdowns would probably need his or her head examined, because if China is completely reversed and opened and proudly saying 80% of the Chinese have been infected, which means they have the what we call population-wide immunity or herd immunity, then the science is very clear that, look, it's it may sound very inappropriate, but it is more the merrier. The bigger the spread of this pandemic, the more insulated we are from this, disease, because it's like a natural shot you have got. So with this, all this knowledge, we ventured and sort of, fought to stay afloat. A lot of campaigning and, writing open letters, some of you might have seen, encouraging the industry to not lose hope. And then whenever it was possible, we would launch the show against all odds, because the risk would be very heavy, because show is something which is the last thing a government would want, where the restrictions are that, look, you can't, go to personally to a house, from one person to another at that time, but then somehow it worked out, and we were able to influence the matters that look, this is like high time, we should open up. And so, we had one TTF and then 2 OTMs last year.
Yes, that's right.
And now, if you allow me, since we have some time, I would like to throw open a new challenge, in this VUCA perspective, and how much this could be a challenge, the threat of war, So, what could be the, looks like isolated, but there is a talk of, even World War III. So, do you see a kind of, in a forward-looking sense, a kind of a VUCA risk, or how do we prepare for something like that?
Thanks, Sanjeev. Just back on the COVID point as well, I think the big thing to mention as well is that 10% of the global workforce is employed through the hospitality sector, right? So it's taken an absolute hammering. So we as tourism boards or product owners, of course, we want to continue to promote our destinations or our products or services. But of course, ultimately, a lot of those decisions are taken out of our hands. So I think the travel industry generally, I think we are probably one of the most resilient and adaptable industries there is, because we have to be. One of the sayings I always like, I know it relates more to business than perhaps a destination management office, but Steve Jobs said, and he did a reasonable job of developing his Apple product, but he said that when the company's doing really well, you should when a company's doing badly, you should change. But he said when it's doing well, you should change as well. So I think adaptability is the key, and there's always something, right? So COVID held us up. I totally agree with Sanjeev. I think it was blown out of proportion. I think a lot of the press have a lot to do with that, with sensationalizing it. And we shouldn't have put the world on hold for such a prolonged period of time. But then as I said, because it was so sensationalized, I think that it sort of took a bit of a life of its own. But I think the key thing, as I said, there's always something. What do we have? Ash clouds. We have bird flu. We have mad cow diseases. We have everything that we have to adapt and deal with. So I think it's more about you can't predict the unpredictable. So it's just a case of trying to do your planning as best you can. Have as you touched on earlier, have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. Have a backup. Don't rely too heavily on certain sectors or profiles. If we're talking about MICE, make sure that you're venturing into as many prospective markets or sectors as you can, to not be too heavily reliant on one or the other. And as I say, be in a position to be as agile as you can when situations arise. As I say, I don't think you can't overthink it. It's just a scenario that you've got to deal with it as and when it comes along. So, and I really feel for things like the cruise lines, because what a potential nightmare they've got. So if they're doing, I don't know, 5 or 6 ports of call in different destinations where they've all got completely different rules, how on earth are they going to deal with that? So I mean, we tried as Qatar, cruising is a very important development area for us with our fabulous new port. But we literally had to have completely separate conversations with our Ministry of Public Health about cruise, because you couldn't, there's no way you could apply the same protocols on people flying in, individuals flying in by air as you could with cruise, because cruise people are getting on a ship, going to be on a ship for a while, calling into different ports of call where the rules are slightly different. So again, you need a plan to make sure that you're going to be able to work with the cruise lines and make sure that you're going to be able to welcome when their guests come in. So I don't think there's a magic wand on it. I think it's just a case of being, and Sanjeev is a good example. He took the plunge on, and we joined the event that happened in. It was the first event, wasn't it, in 2020? That's right. So we did the first one in March 2022, and then the second one. So we felt it was the right time. It was busy, so it showed that the market was ready for it. So I don't think we had any major outbreaks after that. So I think perhaps the science proved us right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's we want people to travel. It's people's right to be able to travel. But I think more importantly, it employs employs so many people either directly or indirectly, and you can't have an industry as large as ours not being able to be continually constrained and not being able to continue to flourish and give people livelihoods and incomes, etc. So that would be my view on it.
So Phil, just adding on to that, you said, I mean, that we've had pandemics in the past and the bird flu, swine flu, etc. But learning from this, maybe, or do you already have a long-term strategy in place at maybe Singapore Tourism Board or Qatar Tourism, if you can let us know, as how do you look at it for, say, 2024, 2025? Do you think that, this is a risk which would prevail going forward as well, and you have a strategy in place for that already? Some kind of a plan or something of that sort? And then, obviously, you can't predict the exact nature of the crisis which would come up, but something as a backup, maybe, do you plan to cater to that for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, we're slightly lucky in Qatar because we have a very strong domestic tourism, because the locals have wealth and they tend to frequent the hotels and restaurants and malls and spend as well. Now, when they can travel freely because they can afford to, they'll travel, right? So they'll go to lots of other destinations. We know that they'll go to Europe in the summer. And they'll potentially go skiing and etc. in the winter. Now, if they can't travel because there's restrictions and borders are closed, they're going to stay in Qatar, but they still want to enjoy themselves. So we're probably in a slightly unique position. But I think, as I said earlier, you don't want to have too heavy a reliance on. I know it's difficult because a lot of it boils down to connectivity and flights and markets that you can best serve, and it's easy for them to get into the country. But there's a certain amount of planning you can do. But I think that these things. I mean, nobody would have seen the world shutting down for a year. I mean, how would you plan for that? So I think it's a case of, as I mentioned earlier, just having not necessarily all your eggs in one basket, but then making sure that you're in a position to put into place other measures if the sort of situation arises.
I think for Singapore, couple of points. I mean, domestic tourism, we never had domestic tourism. And when COVID hit, we had domestic tourism. So we had Singapore Rediscover, and we were telling the Singaporeans to come out and look at the attractions and experiences. So we had domestic tourism. So it is a adaptability and agility, which is, luckily, within Singapore's context, there's a few players, right? Whole of government, the entire government machinery stepped in, and we were looking at how do we best coordinate the responses. Number two, there's PPP, public-private partnerships. Singapore Tourism Board is the champion of tourism, but we cannot do anything on our own, right? None of us can do. All the tourism bodies, we are in partnership with our tourism stakeholders, in partnership with what I call travel trade partner friends. If the Indian travel trade partner friends are not promoting Singapore, then we've got a major issue, right? So I think that private-public partnership in Singapore's context, that's important, but of course the outreach in market is also important. I think the final third point is, and I like the word that was used in Skift presentation yesterday, perm anxiety. There's now a sense of perm anxiety, and I was thinking about it actually, is it because our own knowledge of history is quite limited? I mean, perm anxiety, I mean, I'm sure back in the history, whether it's world wars or whatever, I mean, there was always anxiety in some part of the world, right? But I think that it's an interesting concept to have, that perm anxiety then, which is what I think Singapore has all time. We have perm anxiety. Existential question. We're a small country, within Southeast Asia. So I think that perm anxiety, two ways of doing it. You go into a state of inertia. You don't do anything. You just lock up yourself in the room and pray things open up, and the next day you open the door, everything is bright and sunny. Or you go and take initiative. And I think that's what we try to do. To your point, whether we plan ahead, yes, as Philip said, you plan for contingencies, you plan for certain trajectories. We have announced a $500 million tourism recovery fund. Over the next few years, we want to revive the tourism industry and also do marketing outreach. So there are such plans. But I think the basic line is, you plan as much as possible, but action is very important, right? Yeah.
Naresh, may I ask you a question, curious question? At the early stages of pandemic, cruise were the worst hit, like we all remember pictures of, as if, this pandemic came through cruise or something like that, And yesterday, we saw in Megatrends that cruise is probably going to grow the highest, because it starts with a low base probably, So what is the state of the market right now? Like, are you seeing that big jump from that very low base? Are you back to more or less pre-pandemic levels? If not, when do you see it coming back? Are there still problems of perception that no, cruise is dirtier than as if, outside? Would you like to say anything on that?
Okay. So as you rightly said, yes, when this whole news of one particular cruise ship getting stuck, it was possibly the biggest news. But do you really blame the cruise line? No. Let's be honest, even a lot of countries did not know how to handle that situation. Forget about an organization running a cruise line. Sure. So a lot of doctors, a lot of scientists didn't know what to do. So yes, it did become a big story. Now, post that, are the numbers back? If you ask me, cruising today is back in action. The ships are going full, and they are getting filled much ahead in time. The ships that we have are operating at close to about 125% occupancies. So cruising is back. Now, why has this numbers come in so easily? Or there's a lot of effort that went in these 2 years by not only the entire cruising industry per se. A lot of myths that started flowing around with that particular incident had to be broken. What if there's recirculation of air in the cabin? If a cabin next to me has a COVID case, will I also get COVID? But they don't understand. There is actually no recirculation of air. So we had to bring in a lot of scientific references to it by saying, in your cabin, it's fresh air in and air out. We don't recirculate air. You can't do it on a cruise. These cruise ships are very modern today, so they don't work that way. So a lot of education had to go behind it. A lot of initiatives came in terms of repositioning cruising as a holiday option. So yes, it was a collective effort by every possible cruise line stakeholder internationally, and that's where the cruising industry, I would say today, is back where it started. Yes, the dynamics, the demographics have changed. As Sridhar said earlier, nobody thought that Singapore had domestic tourism. But actually speaking, during the COVID time, ships were operating in Singapore and being supported only by Singapore nationals because the rest of the world was shut. So we also at one point of time always thought, oh, we have a ship there 365 days in a year. How many times with that population would you keep going back on a ship? But the ships survived. It's purely because the domestic tourism of Singapore supported, and not just one, 2 cruise line ships. So yeah.
Very well. So for me, takeaway is, this CA in VUCA, I would say confidence building activism, because, and you guys are in a very special position because if, most of these decisions are taken by government. And if, the news could travel to the respective, departments who handle these restrictions, then look, it is like kind of a counterproductive and we are harming ourselves, we are harming our economy. And so, I think that's a very big takeaway. And, this FIFA, you see this World Cup was a shining example because when we heard the first rebellion in China, a lot of, this television channels reported that when they saw people cheering in Qatar, they said, no, we don't want to be, like, how long we will live under this kind of a lockdown, etc. And that's how those posters started coming and shouting and, sloganeering and all that, So, yeah, that confidence building activism is probably been required for some time. Nobody likes it, So now you can wrap up.
So I think we're getting a lot of new definitions for VUCA that we can put out our articles on. So that's very interesting, very nice. Before we close, any questions from the audience, if anybody would like to ask something to our panelists here?
Yeah, please come forward.
Thank you, guys. My name is Shwetank. I'm from Rainbow Vacations, Jaipur. Open question for all. What would be your advice to the travel fraternity? Should we throw the long-term planning out of the window in VUCA times, or should we look at this ultra short-term planning on a very, very serious note? What is just your advice to us guys? Thank you so much.
So, I'd done some, thinking and work on it, and you see, like I said in many of the open letters I wrote for the industry, and it applies to me, I'm also part of the industry. First, protect yourself for survival. So, you must survive. So, you must act in a way that, look, if any problem comes, if a tsunami comes, how will I survive even if the tsunami comes? So you have, that kind of a thinking that, look, this kind of a problem may come. World war may happen. How will I survive? And second is that, look, you take care of your employees. Survival doesn't mean, you have to fire everyone and, reduce the pay very drastically. But, that little bit of give and take, that how to take care of employees also, we had a heart-to-heart communication, and they also developed a kind of, mutual trust that, we would take a cut if, there are problems. And some of them found their way into another industry. And that also we encouraged, If in tough times, it's like, we have to look at our survival, then employees' survival. And then, simple tricks like, I would call it confidence building activism or measures, like, insurance, adding insurance into your product. I have thought about it, and, market is giving signals that they like insurance with every travel product, Insurance sales have gone up like, zoomed up like anything after the pandemic. It doesn't cost much. So if you sort of, add insurance to your product, for example, cancellation, cancellation is a big risk, I have personal experience, my children, wanting to go somewhere just after marriage, book the trip. Then, suddenly you say the visa is not coming, the trip is cancelled, all money gone. So there, I would encourage you to think, hard on insurance. There are cancellation for any reason insurance products available abroad, But I researched in India, we don't have that, you know, for a 10%, 8 to 10% cost of the trip. There can be a cancellation for any reason insurance, which would give you the peace of mind that anything happens, your 90% is safe. You know. So these are a few pennies I could, you know, or few paisa worth of advice I could give. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Sanjeev's covered it pretty much. Probably the only thing I'd add, without, I mean, stating the obvious, but I wouldn't overcommit yourself. I'm sure you wouldn't anyway. But I mean, you've got to look at if you've got any sort of a longer term plans, I would do some pretty serious risk assessment to make sure you're not sort of overcommitting yourself on anything, because if, as you say, if the unexpected, as it did with COVID, does happen, then you could be exposed, and that could be costly. So I think that would probably be my add-on to Sanjeev's points. The insurance one's a really interesting one, actually, because we now have exactly that situation in Qatar where, again, our Ministry of Public Health want to introduce a international traveller insurance to all of our arriving guests. It's not very expensive. It's 50 Qatari riyals, which is $10. But it's an inconvenience, because it's another thing that the international guest has got to think about. And we're getting pushback, quite understandably, from guests and consumers, because they say, well, hang on a minute, I've already got an international policy that covers me for Qatar, so why are you asking me to take a Qatar insurance? But of course, Ministry of Public Health is saying, well, it's our insurance cover. We probably wouldn't be able to understand or recognize a Chinese one if it's written when people are checking at immigration. So I sort of see both sides, but it's so now we have been, and we still are in dialogue with Ministry of Public Health to say, yes, we understand why you've done it, because otherwise people will rock up and could have a very, you know, expensive major operation, but they can't afford to pay for it, because we have stunning hospitals, but you have to pay for them. So now we're, as I said, we're in dialogue with the Ministry of Public Health to say, look, you really do probably need to accept the international policies, because people don't want to buy, even though it's cheap, they don't want to buy 2 sets of insurance. But for the reasons Sanjeev said, I can understand the Ministry of Public Health's thinking as well. So yeah, my added point would probably be more around don't overcommit yourself.
If I could just add a quick one. So from a government perspective, there's always a long-term strategy and a goal, and I think that's relevant for any business. If there's no compass, no direction where you're headed, where's your business going, you don't have a 2030, 2035 kind of plans, I think it's going to be very difficult to survive. But having said that, even in a government perspective, there's always the small tweaks, the milestones we call them, right? So from a survival mode to a recovery mode, even back then, we were talking about sustainability in the future. 2030, what is our strategy for water conservation? What is our strategy for environment protection? And having plans in place for that. So I think, and at the same time, you're then seizing the opportunities as they come, right? So similarly for business, you have to reimagine. I'm sure a lot of the travel trade reimagined your businesses. You went into verticals that never existed. I mean, we went into domestic tourism, never existed for us. So I think a long-term strategy, goal, very important, directions, very important. But tweaks, re-engineering, reimagining, seizing opportunities, very important as well. So it's a dance for me. Yeah. Thank you.
Would there be any other questions, or? All right, I think we've had a great discussion and some great learnings that we've got out of this. The planning which is needed, the vision which is needed. I think adapt with agility is something which came out as a theme out of this. Singapore reimagined. I think you lived up to that tagline and took up domestic tourism also in a big way. And thank you so much again for giving us a new definition of VUCA. So while I'm not as creative as Mr. Sridhar here, but I did manage to copy-paste something from a managerial article which said that the best way to counter VUCA is counter volatility with vision, meet uncertainty with understanding, react to complexity with clarity, and fight ambiguity with agility. So with that, I think we thank all the panelists here on stage for their words of wisdom for everyone. Thank you so much for your time. And we hope that you all also had a good learning out of this session. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.